In the middle of the massive ongoing psychological warfare operation regarding an imminent United States attack on Iran, in this video, we will attempt to find out about the likelihood of such an attack and what could be realistically achieved, taking into account Iran's potential responses. Contrary to what is now mainstream belief in the media and internet sphere, this video will present a different picture of the situation, one grounded in realist facts rather than simplistic intuitive narratives. Like and subscribe if you want to support the channel in the algorithm. Now let's start. This video is the second one of a series examining the ongoing Iran-US crisis of early 2026. In the first part, linked above, we examined the geostrategic aspects of the crisis. In this video, however, we will analyze the military tactical dimension and balance between the United States and Iran. The situation is complicated by the dominance the United States side holds over the social media landscape, coupled with Iran's far inferior ability to convey its perspective to the world. Adding to this complexity is the madman policy of US President Trump, which creates an ambiguous condition in which apparently no one clearly knows what he intends to do. This intentional ambiguity only increases the difficulty of reaching a realistic perspective on the situation and the true balance of power. The key question revolves around the capabilities the US possesses against Iran. Is it capable of carrying out a clean military campaign that would severely degrade Iran's military potential, or even topple its government? Or is the situation entirely the opposite, namely, a posture of force that any nation in the midst of critical negotiations would utilize to improve its bargaining position? US President Trump did, in fact, carry out a spectacular, clean-cut military operation a short while before the Iran-US crisis by capturing Venezuelan President Maduro with Special Operations Forces. This event had a significant impact on the narrative the United States projects to people around the world regarding its capabilities, suggesting they cannot be matched by any nation. In the Venezuelan crisis, the United States president also warned his opponent to basically accept the conditions dictated to it. The United States narrative now seeks to apply the same framework to Iran, which is in the midst of negotiations with the US side. However, the truth is that although this would work against 95% of the nations, the operation against Venezuela is by no means applicable to Iran. Iran is a major military power, one certain to fight back with massive firepower, a capability that nations like Venezuela almost entirely lack. Furthermore, Iran's leadership is situated in the capital city of Tehran, while Venezuela's capital, Caracas, is a coastal city. This geography means that the Earth's curvature would block detection of any incoming adversary heliborne force at just about 40 kilometers out at sea. This specific situation enabled a quick surprise operation with very low warning time for the Venezuelans. Reaching Tehran, however, is an entirely different matter, and warning would certainly arrive much more quickly to the Iranian leadership, allowing it to defend against such a heliborne Special Operations Forces scenario. During the 12-day conflict in summer 2025, Israel did employ unique capabilities, such as low-signature, air-launched aeroballistic missiles, to surprise Iran and kill several of its key military leaders. Compared to that, the United States lacks such a prompt reaction weapon as the Israeli Golden Horizon missile, a video about it linked above. The only weapon the United States is currently known to possess that has a sufficiently low time of arrival and high speed is the Dark Eagle hypersonic surface-to-surface missile. And just as Israeli and United States missile defenses were unable to intercept Iran's aeroballistic and hypersonic missile types during the 12-day conflict, Iran also possesses no viable means to intercept a weapon like the Dark Eagle. Now, the reality is that the Dark Eagle is currently deployed in very low numbers, as it is an extremely expensive weapon system. However, as happened during the 12-day conflict between Iran and Israel, the attacker always seeks to create the impression of having penetrated the heaviest defended regions of the opponent, namely its capital city. Such a shocking effect can then be used to demoralize the population by employing psychological operations narratives. For instance, claiming to have instantly gained air superiority over the opponent, and using the impact of rare high-end assets like the Dark Eagle or Golden Horizon as proof of that claim. The following point must be stressed. Common narratives promoted by President Trump regarding air power assets, like the low-observable B-2 bomber being able to perform a similar type of prompt strike mission, are disinformation. Such assets possess neither the necessary speed nor a sufficiently undetectable signature to function as a prompt attack-type shock weapon. A prolonged air defense suppression campaign would be needed for a F-35 or B-2 to make it to Tehran. Against Venezuela, the proximity of the coastal city of Caracas to the sea meant that even subsonic cruise missiles like the JASSM could arrive at their targets quickly enough to enable a surprise attack condition. But as powerful as a cruise missile like the JASSM is, it is not a prompt reaction type weapon and would need to fly for prolonged periods inside Iranian airspace to reach its target. Any indication of it flying toward Tehran, such as simply the sound of it being heard by a local person with a mobile phone, could destroy the element of surprise and allow the leadership to disperse or relocate to safe locations. Hence, this addresses the matter of U.S. capabilities to conduct a decapitation strike that would quickly eliminate Tehran's leadership, the kind of simplistic, elegant campaign envisioned in the minds of supporters of a United States intervention. Concepts such as the U.S. president's claimed discombobulator, or near-magical capabilities in electronic warfare, as well as EMP weapons that would disable Iran's military equipment from great distances, can be sorted into the category of psychological operation myths propagated by the U.S. Yes, each of these capabilities may exist and are indeed impressive, but they have significant limitations, and Iran has certainly become familiar with them in the course of the 12-day conflict with Israel, which was granted full support by U.S. non-kinetic military capabilities, missile defense interceptors excluded. So now, let us move further from the shock and surprise element the United States military is capable of and assess the real tactical military dimension of a serious military campaign. Here, it must be stated that the events of the last years have clearly disincentivized U.S. allies in the Middle East from supporting a military intervention against Iran. The backlash these countries would face in such a conflict has led to a situation in which they have denied the United States the use of the several massive bases they possess in Arab countries, particularly in the Persian Gulf, but also Turkey. Even the United Kingdom has now denied the use of its overseas territory, Diego Garcia Island, for military operations against Iran. This indicates that there are compelling reasons for all these countries to avoid any involvement whatsoever in an aggression against a nation possessing retaliation capabilities like those of Iran. This particular factor alone is so significant in the analysis of the Iran crisis that it can independently determine whether the potential for an attack is realistic or not. Militarily, the distance of an airbase from the targeted country is of greatest importance. Tactical fighter jets carrying heavy weapons have a quite limited range. If those key U.S. regional bases, located approximately 300 to 500 kilometers from Iran, cannot be operated from, the sortie rate that U.S. air power can generate collapses dramatically. Even if tanker aircraft are employed to extend range and enable operations from air bases such as those in Israel, the cycle time required for each sortie increases substantially. As a result, the firepower that United States tactical air power can project toward Iran becomes greatly reduced. Currently, only Jordan has permitted U.S. air power to use its territory for defensive air operations. This means that, instead of being allowed to fly strike missions against Iran, the fighters stationed there are restricted to patrol and interception operations, specifically to intercept Iranian one-way attack drones and long-range land attack cruise missiles such as the Pave. Consequently, the most realistic scenario at present would involve flying all air power assets out of the regional bases, excluding Jordan, and stationing them at a large, distant Israeli airbase like Ovda. The necessary tanker aircraft that would enable fighters to reach Iran from Israel would then need to be stationed mainly at rather secure locations such as Cyprus and Greece. I am referring here to the bulk of the military power the United States has deployed to the Middle East. There are bases in Syria and Iraqi Kurdistan that could also be utilized for lower-tier assets such as helicopters. However, it is almost certain that these bases, positioned closer to Iran, would be heavily targeted by Iranian allies in Iraq, which would drastically reduce any effect they might have in a military campaign against Iran. The frequently reported air power deployments by the US are fewer than most people think. They have still not reached levels anywhere near those used in Operation Iraqi Freedom or even Desert Storm. And that was against an Iraq that is not comparable to the Iran of 2026, an Iraq that had been essentially under siege for 12 years prior to the final US attack. There exists a compelling argument from the US side that its intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capabilities of the current era, combined with artificial intelligence, allow for a much more efficient use of its available firepower. This, it is claimed, makes massive force deployments on the scale of Desert Storm unnecessary today, especially given that no ground campaign is planned. This is, to some degree, true. Iran observed the low cycle time the Israelis, supported by United States intelligence, required from detection to initiation of attack, operating within mere minutes. The enhanced identification capabilities enabled by artificial intelligence today alone make a significant difference. The analysis of big data from all available sensors, fused together to automatically identify critical threats, namely missile launch vehicles disguised as civilian trucks, is certainly a serious threat to Iran. However, this conclusion is a false one, because it rests on the assumption that while the United States has made these intelligence and communication advances in recent decades, Iran has not improved parameters such as the time required for setting up a missile, launching it, and moving back into hiding, or reducing missile launcher cost and quantity, or altogether different basing methods, such as cavern launch-equipped missile cities. Moreover, low-footprint and hardly detectable deployment signature assets like the Shahed 236 drone have drastically changed the way long-distance strikes can be performed at very low cost and in very high quantities. During the previous conflicts with Israel, Iran merely used its one-way attack drones and cruise missiles to reduce the air power resources Israel could commit to striking Iran. But this time, the situation would be very different. Mass launches of drones at a later phase would certainly occur when ballistic missiles have already degraded air defenses and disrupted air power operations. The next point we will examine is the US Navy, which has now brought 2 carrier strike groups to the Middle East region. One is operating at a distance of several hundred kilometers from Iran in the Arabian Sea, while the other is almost certainly intended to provide defensive support to Israel. This second group would use its Aegis destroyers as ballistic missile defense ships and its carrier-based fighters for interception of the aforementioned Iranian drones and cruise missiles. This deployment is absolutely not comparable to what the US deployed in its campaigns against Iraq, where approximately half of the around 10 US aircraft carriers were positioned within close striking range of Iraq. In 2026, by contrast, it is essentially just the Lincoln Strike Group that could potentially reach southern Iran, and even that would require in-flight refueling. This distance to Iran, and the fact that operating out of the Persian Gulf is not even being contemplated, is due to Iran's upper-tier anti-shipping capabilities. These come in the form of anti-ship aeroballistic missiles, a unique capability that only very few nations in the world possess at such extended ranges as 2,000 kilometers. The Lincoln is essentially tasked only with making the closure of the Strait of Hormuz more difficult for Iran, should such an escalation level ever be reached. The limited aircraft launch rates of a carrier and the range limitations of the F/A-18 Super Hornet mean that this asset alone would have only minor impacts on any military campaign. A much greater impact would be made by Israeli participation in such a US attack scenario. Striking Israel is the first and lowest escalation step Iran would immediately take, even before hitting Jordan or the United Arab Emirates, or even feeling the need to close the Strait of Hormuz. However, as demonstrated during the 12-day conflict last summer, the power projection Israel is able to generate against distant Iran remains limited, particularly in terms of weapons capable of neutralizing hardened targets. The sophisticated Israeli standoff weapons and drones utilized had a significant impact against Iranian soft targets during last summer's conflict. But they are almost useless against targets that are hardened or located within Iran's vast tunnel complexes. The effects of the summer campaign are also not directly applicable to a renewed conflict today. Israel expended much of its covert sabotage assets, which had been smuggled into Iran over decades. This advantage is now essentially burned. Israel also employed massive numbers of its sophisticated standoff weapons, which are expensive and require long production cycles to replenish in the Israeli offensive arsenal. Furthermore, this time Iran's missile firepower would not merely be responsive to Israeli attacks. It would likely target Israeli air bases on a much larger scale, involving the activation of missile assets that Iran did not employ during the 12-day conflict. These include assets such as its missile cities positioned in the Iranian heartland, rather than those in the border regions, as well as missiles like the Khorramshahr series, which are considerably more capable than the older Imad and Etimad missiles primarily used back then. Indeed, last summer, Iran did not perceive the firepower Israel generated against it as significant enough to warrant escalation to a higher level. The mere threat that Iran would transform the conflict into a war of attrition was sufficient to compel Israel to convince US President Trump to request a ceasefire from Iran. In that conflict, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy played no role, but this would be very different in the case of a US aggression. Much of the US military resources would need to be invested in countering the IRGC Navy to prevent giving Iran the option of the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. Furthermore, during the Iran-Israel conflict last summer, Iran's allies in Iraq, Lebanon's Hezbollah, and most importantly Yemen's Ansarallah did not participate, as there was no need for such support from an Iranian perspective. However, the situation would be profoundly different if the United States decided to attack Iran. This time, all of these Iranian allies would become involved, in addition to Iran's naval forces, unlocking an entirely different set of capabilities that were absent last summer. Especially Ansarallah's control of the Bab el-Mandab maritime choke point could basically escalate the conflict to a serious regional war, with massive impact on world economy. Hence, overall, we are confronted with a situation that can be described as having a probable outcome not much different from the 12-day conflict. US force deployments are insufficient for a larger military campaign, and the inability to use nearby bases for operations against Iran means that their projected firepower is drastically reduced. When this reality is viewed alongside the potential involvement of Iran's naval forces and its allies, a picture emerges that is far from the overmatch condition the United States and Israel would require to effectively handle an opponent like Iran. What this scenario much more closely resembles is a defensive posture, one designed to raise the cost of an Iranian revenge attack against Israel, rather than the other way around. US air power deployment would be utilized to neutralize the threat posed by Iranian drones and cruise missiles, while its Navy would provide additional missile defense capabilities and act as a deterrent against Iran, closing the Strait of Hormuz to Western commercial shipping. To enable a serious military campaign against Iran itself, a true overmatch would be necessary. This would require several times the amount of deployed US military power, along with the willingness to endure massive losses when operating in close proximity to Iran. In return, the benefit would be increased sortie generation rate and the ability to conduct deep strikes into Iran with high firepower. A high-risk gamble by any means. So, one may even ask, who is the threatened nation at this moment? Iran, or rather Israel? In conclusion, due to all these facts, the situation is drastically different from the current mainstream narrative. The US military buildup appears much more to be forced posturing for negotiations and the construction of defensive capabilities designed to disincentivize Iran from attacking Israel. The risks involved in a serious and prolonged and large-scale campaign against Iran are by no means acceptable without a clear military overmatch. and that overmatch has obviously not yet materialized. Even if the risks are accepted and a military campaign is initiated, there exists no robust exit strategy from such a conflict. The likelihood that Iran would once again decide if and when the war ends, as it basically did last summer, remains high. Furthermore, Iran would certainly exploit any aggression to destructively strike the most vulnerable link in the United States attack plan: Israel. So that's all for today. If you liked it, give a thumbs up, comment, and subscribe. It really makes a difference in the YouTube algorithm and is a great support to the channel. The Real Enthusiast can become members and given access to exciting membership area material. Thanks for your support and motivation. See you next time.